Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest InSport Immersive seminar. I think we've got nearly 50 people live and about 100 registrations. There's absolutely no pressure on myself and Rowena at the moment. You'll notice that Heather hasn't been able to join us yet. She's been stuck in traffic. She's just tried to dial in on her phone and has been struggling. So we're hoping that we have an invitation out to Heather and she will join us at some point over the next half an hour. But if she doesn't, trust me, after when I say this, having had a discussion with Rowena the other day, that we are in very, very safe hands here, and we can explore a load of issues regarding women's representation, diversity, BAME representation, and so on in the context of sport. And there is a huge amount of stuff for us to go through. But I'd like to introduce Rowena to you all first. Rowena's a partner at Level and the MD at GenSport. Good morning, Rowena.
Hi, Rob. How you doing?
Yes, not too bad. We've just been chatting off camera in green room and kind of getting a little bit stressed that Heather's not been around. Just give the people that have tuned in just a little bit of background about yourself and where you've come from, what sort of jobs you've been doing, because your profile's pretty high. When I was surfing your LinkedIn account the other day, this is just some incredible jobs that you're doing. So let everybody know who you are and what you do.
So Rob, I'm a lawyer by profession. I've been working for about the last 15 years in the commercialization of sport. So working with international federations on the sale of sponsorship and broadcasting rights. And then for the last year and a half, I've gone back into private practice with niche sports law firm Level. And then also I set up my own commercial consultancy. And as part of that, I do a real broad range of things, from everything from sort of commercial strategy and sales to a real focus on female empowerment and diversity, as well as activity. I'm a non-exec of SIMSPA, the professional development body for the sport and physical activity sector. So really interesting time there, also around workforce and sport. And then I have a few consultancies with some agencies as well. So yeah, quite broad.
Quite broad and very, very busy, but some fabulous experiences. And I was involved with SIMSPA a little bit on the higher education steering group a few years ago. So we might get there and some of the challenges for SIMSPA actually, if time permits. We're expecting about half an hour, 40 minutes, I think, today, and that will not do these issues anywhere near the justice that they probably need. And when I was talking on a previous webinar, we started with the whole Black Lives Matter campaign and how that had really put a spotlight on some real inequalities that we're seeing across the world, particularly in the UK as well. But also when we then really start focusing those issues down. The impact of campaigns like Black Lives Matter to the context of sport. But this is where I put my hands up. As a white middle class male, it's really difficult sometimes to understand some of the intricacies of those campaigns and those arguments. Excuse me. And actually, it's quite a fearful debate to engage with from my point of view, because you're so scared of saying the wrong thing. So just unpack for me a little bit what we were discussing the other day with regard to Black Lives Matter, particularly your perspectives on gender inequality as well, because I think that will give us a nice platform to start this discussion.
Yeah, it's it's a really, we talked about this. It's where do you start? It's such an interesting time. This isn't a new issue for anyone. In sports, in particular, we have a bit of a history of being very white male, and that comes from right from the start, from participation. From a long time ago, a lot of sports were very, very focused on men and probably higher income brackets, so which is why we've seen traditionally that as a follow through. But yeah, no, I mean it's something that has been talked about so much. The code of governance for sport that came into force 3 years ago went a considerable way to addressing gender balance, but the commitment was somewhat weaker in relation to ethnic and other diversity, such as disability. And really, we've struggled to see change in those areas. And now with Black Lives Matters, I think, you know, there's two levels of that. There's obviously the inherent racism that you talk about, that, you know, things like the George Floyd murder, which is obviously horrendous. But then you've also got things like inherent.
Hello, Heather. You are live and talking to 100 people, so.
All right, let's see if I can. The dodgy connection, and I'll do my best. I'm so sorry, everybody.
All right, no worries. Sorry, Rowena, carry on, and then Heather, I'm sure we'll be able to hear and we'll contribute if she can.
Yeah, I was just explaining, Heather, that there's the element of Black Lives Matter, that there's the racism element, and then also the inherent bias that we see in organisational level, working level, sport level, and our focus is on sport today, and yeah, really highlighting that, and everybody right now is trying to figure out what to do, and how we manage this moving forward, because, like you say, it is a really sensitive subject. You know, I've done a lot of inward thinking myself at how I potentially have contributed to the problem, because, you know, I don't talk about my ethnicity. I talk about my gender, and feel very comfortable in that, and probably that's come because of the stage we've got to in terms of gender diversity, but certainly race is always a little bit more sensitive. I've never wanted to feel like I'm playing the race card, but actually the most important thing right now is that we're all talking about it, and it's you know, it's great to have webinars like this, to just get people to be aware of it and understand that perhaps it's a way that we've all been brought up to think and act and behave that we're just so unaware of, that's brought us to where we are today.
Some fascinating stuff there, and I think what you're alluding to there is that we've taken some steps historically, and when I say historically, I mean over the last probably 15 to 20 years potentially. You talked about there the code of governance and trying to encourage more women to go onto boards. But I think, if I'm understanding what you're saying right, there's almost been this acceptance that some of these changes would come about simply through osmosis, and as society's changed, as education changes, as more people access, you know, the privilege that I've had and you've had of going into higher education and becoming qualified and then going on to good jobs, that would naturally kind of change the landscape. But if I'm right in what I'm thinking, we haven't seen the pace of change that we really needed to see over the last 10 or 15 years, which I think has really stimulated then campaigns like Black Lives Matter to really, I think, to polarize the argument, actually, to say we should have made more progress than we have done. This still isn't right, and we now need to start calling out some of these issues much more publicly to try and affect some real change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the number of people who've said to me, how is this really still an issue in the 21st century? And it's absolutely correct. You know, I mean, it's crazy that we're still having this conversation and having this debate, but it's very real, you know, and the figures show that. As really, we've seen some crazy stats come out over the last few weeks, especially. And it's now's the time. And, you know, and I've said this in another podcast I did recently about how the Martin Luther King speech was 60 years ago. And yet we're still having issues like this overtly taking place. And, you know, now we really, really actually need to address it once and for all.
And I think we've just had a comment in the box, actually. It's almost unpacked some of my line of thinking at the moment, because the purpose of the webinar and what we've just been talking about there reflects quite significantly on race imbalances and inequalities, on gender inequalities and imbalances. But what we're actually talking about here is a much broader spectrum of diversity, and diversity generally, but diversity particularly in sport. And in that diversity bracket, we would bring in things like LGBT plus, race, disability, diversity, and so on and so on. So whilst some things like Black Lives Matter are shining a spotlight on a very specific part of that diversity campaign. We're actually talking here about diversity in much broader terms, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the Code of Governance, the idea was to make us more diverse as an industry. It had a real focus on women. So unfortunately now we're in the process of reviewing it with a focus on BAME. But actually, I hope that the review is going to take into consideration disability, LGBT, because actually we don't want to just be going through this process in 3 years' time when the next big issue arises. Actually, the issue is across all diversity. There's a particular focus on racism at the moment, exactly for the reasons that we've said. It is quite endemic. It's quite traumatic, actually, everything we're experiencing right now. So it is a focal point. But actually, the changes that we should be making should be applying across all levels of diversity, because we don't want to be doing this again.
Absolutely. And so I'm now thinking to myself, right, how do I ask you a question about giving us some examples of what you've experienced in your career, actually, without necessarily giving any real specifics that, wouldn't necessarily be right to do in a live webinar. But just talk us through, you're a very educated young woman. You're very powerful in the roles that you now hold and that you have held. You've got a master's degree in international sport management. You've got all your law qualifications. What have you faced in your career over the last 10 or 15 years? What have been the biggest hurdles for you?
I guess there comes a point when you've established yourself when again it's changing stereotypes. So people don't necessarily look at me anymore as being in a box. But certainly when I was trying to get into the sports industry, it was really difficult for me. And again, we had a bit of a chat about this before. It's really difficult to say, was I not selected for that role because I'm a woman and because I'm Asian, or was I just underqualified? More recently, we will come on to the makeup of the UK sporting boards. I have applied to a number of the sports boards where they are significantly lacking diversity. And again, you start to question, well, is it because I wasn't capable of that role, or was there actually some bias against me that counted against me? But it's one of those crazy things that you don't know. And I'm a very positive person, so I wouldn't say, oh yeah, that was because of that. I would just think, okay, that wasn't the role for me, and move on. But it's not quite that easy. And actually, probably I need to be calling it out, because I'm in the position where I have a mouthpiece and I can speak for people who perhaps don't have that ability to do that. So it's been a real range of things, and some things have been, I use the term sometimes quite traumatic, and other things have been more subtle. But certainly it shows that as a society we need to change our attitudes. And again, I think there is extreme levels of racism, but I think there's also just this concept of inherent bias that we're all guilty of. It's part of our upbringing. It's part of what we see on television. It's things like seeing female pilots and male nurses, and just things that go against the norm that for us seem strange. And at the moment, that is seeing women, ethnic minorities, disabled people in power, because actually there is this concept of automatic classification based on your socioeconomic situation, which you can't do anything about. It's just inbuilt. So it's looking at how we change that moving forward, or how we address those biases, so that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said. It's almost like you've had to really scale that first initial barrier, and as you've been able to prove yourself in your career subsequently, it's almost normalized you in this kind of strangely unnormalized framework that we appear to be battling with. And it's a very bizarre thing for me to even start thinking about, and how it works.
I think the other thing that's really interesting is this movement that we've seen more towards gender balance in the last few years. And actually, if you look at the diversity report that came out in 2019, something like women accounted for 40% of board members across Sport England and UK sport bodies. But actually, how many of those were diverse in other ways. I'm guessing that the majority of those were white women, because actually there's been this real push for women, but actually not so much ethnic minorities. And then when we talk about BAME, then there's a real focus on BAME men. You know, we had this conversation. When you think about it, you're thinking about how can, when I think of ethnic minorities and Black people, okay, let me think about men in this role. And actually what we've done is we've isolated this group of BAME women who don't, unfortunately, fit either, and everyone's sort of forgotten about them. And actually that's, again, it's just, do we think about women, minority women in that role? And that's, I guess, something that needs to change.
Yeah, just, I mean, while we're talking about this board makeup thing, and I know Heather would chip in quite actively on this discussion now, you know, knowing her as I do. You know, Heather's been very vocal about the fact that women haven't made senior board positions. She was obviously one of the first women, if not, I think she was the first woman, wasn't she, on the FA board, and first woman of colour, of course. She talks actively about how the size of the sport has an opportunity to make a real difference, and we need to see some of these bigger sports. And I know someone's popped a question in the question box about football. Football obviously is a huge sport. Do you think we need to see more representation on those larger sports? And then we deal with some of the smaller sport bodies. I'm thinking about, I don't know, sport like table tennis, because I know one of the non-execs on that particular board. Do you think that would help encourage more people to apply, more people to see that they need to be more diverse in their board makeup? Or do you see it the other way around? Do you think we need to address some of the smaller sports first? I'm just interested in your thoughts about how we might tackle some of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't think it's a question of doing it in isolation. I think it's about how we change mindset of society as a whole, actually. You know, again, it goes back to people seeing people from different backgrounds in these roles, which at the moment we don't see on a lot of boards and a lot of executive teams. And actually, the big sports, they're much more visible. So they would be a good starting point. But for me, it's why wouldn't we do it at the same time for the smaller sports? Just because potentially your pool is smaller for those sports, but perhaps in table tennis, you're more likely to have a more ethnically diverse group of people who have played the sport and have worked their way up than necessarily you might have in swimming, for example. Yeah. So it's really difficult to say, let's pick one sport and focus on it. But absolutely, it's a challenge to look at everything. But I do think it's the task of Sport England and UK Sport to lead this, which is what they're doing. But how we change mindset and de-bias society is a bit more interesting. But I actually think the media has a role to play in this as well. I think
hugely.
So much you read, especially the sports industry news. You always only ever see interviews of white men. It's actually, why don't we? There are so many women doing some amazing things, and also ethnically diverse women as well. Tanni Gray-Thompson. There's a lot of people out there doing great things in sport. But actually, why don't we showcase some of these people so that actually we get used to seeing that actually it's not just white men in the industry, that there's a real mix of people, and then it becomes much more normal in our heads. It's not so shocking that these people are taking on these roles.
Yeah.
I think everyone's involved in this whole process.
Yeah, we did a webinar, goodness me, it must have been 7 or 8 weeks ago now. This lockdown seems to have gone on for so long, with Zara Al-Qudsi, who I think now works for Formula One. She's the commercial partnerships manager there. And I sat back and I just listened to her for a long time talking about how sponsorship and broadcasting could influence some of this stuff. So it's interesting now how you've picked up on the media and the voice that the media has to try and change some of these perceptions and make things much leveler in terms of the playing field, because ultimately that's what this is about doing. And one of the big confusions I think around the Black Lives Matter campaign is not to put put that campaign higher up the order of any particular thinking, but it's actually to bring up the bar and to say actually that everybody is equal and should be treated as such. You talk there, I think, about grassroots and participation, really, and how, you know, different sports might have a different demographic of people coming through the sport. Without trying to go over the osmosis argument too much, because it takes so long to happen, what do you think the importance is at a grassroots level for young women of colour, let's say, to participate in sports and to see a pathway through for them into an administrative type role?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm a woman who played sport, and that's why I've ended up working in sport. I also saw a lot of women drop out of playing sport for a number of reasons, and I think it is a lot harder for young girls. There are a lot of external issues that impact whether they continue in sport or not. And I think that's an important thing. I had this conversation actually with Simspo in our sort of diversity exercise, and I said, actually, if you don't go to your community centre gym or your athletics track and become involved and participate in this, why would you consider working in the industry afterwards? And I know it's not all about that, and there are people who will come to these jobs, but a lot of people think about working in an area that they know something about or understand or enjoy. So actually, I do think the two are interlinked as well to a certain extent. So it is for me, and then also I think that I believe that there's a lot of traits that we learn playing sport that translate directly into the business world and into leadership. So actually, the more women we keep in sport, potentially we end up with a more diverse C-suite board level makeup. So I think there are a lot of benefits that I see personally that sport can have in the longer term. But I think it is a challenge. It's how do you make, you know, I do recognise that as a woman as an ethnic woman, that actually that's a real challenge is getting young minority girls to stay in sport. But this is where I think storytelling is brilliant, you know, in going back to the point about the media and showcasing people. I mean, I remember when Serena Williams was quite groundbreaking in terms of her exposure and us talking about her as a player. But actually, there are so many of these role models that we should be pushing forward to show girls that actually everyone's capable of this. I think that's where it gets, and I think that's how you get girls interested in sport as well. Yeah. Actually, because they are much more interested. Like the relevance and the attachment to the story is much more interesting.
So I'm half glancing across at the comments here, and normally I feel quite confident when I run these webinars that I've got a good handle on the issues of the day, and you know, I'm an academic at a university. I read a lot of evidence, but I've just found myself just completely listening to you and not really concentrating on the comments as much as I should be, because I'm learning so much from you about it. You talk there about role models, and I've seen Maggie Alfonsi's name crop up on the comments box. I know Maggie. I taught her just before Christmas. Spent a bit of time with her, and she's an incredible woman that speaks in a very similar fashion to how you have about role modeling and how important it is for women of colour to have a real mouthpiece and really shout from the rooftops about how successful you can be in the face of adversity. And should we just unpack that role modeling a little bit more? What do you think the real benefits are of, you know, of people listening to yourself and to Maggie and to any other women of colour that might be, you know, really speaking in glowing terms about their involvement in sport and where it could take them?
I think it just shows that it, like you said before, it shows a pathway. I think, you know, it's certainly it's not been easy for me. You know, I'm not 100% sure of Maggie's story, but I'm sure it hasn't been that easy for her either. And I think it's a great way of showcasing to sort of younger girls who have put off or think it's, you know, what's the point sort of attitude. Actually, that there are, you know, there's a lot of us out there, and actually it's just saying, you know, there are opportunities, there are different things that you can be doing, that actually, you know, giving them those choices so that they can actually see themselves in the future. And I think this applies across the board to children, full stop. And I don't think it's a male female thing. I think it's about how we showcase good role models and say, this is what you want to be. But I think some broadcasters are a lot better at doing that than others. And certainly, there's been a big movement now recently to do that. But I think the media is in a really good position to be able to tell those stories and give young people hope that actually that they could do things differently.
Yeah, and I'm trying to move us into, I think, what might be an uncomfortable space for me. A lot of the work I do is around kind of commercialization of sport, the business of it, and I look a lot at the finances of it. And I'm sat here thinking to myself, if I'm an executive in a major sporting organization or a sporting body, and I'm charged with developing the commercial potential of my sport, I'm not blind to what's going on right now. So do you think that in terms of providing a catalyst, that we could look at some of the commercial benefits of having a more diverse board? I think someone's just said something actually in the comments about untapped potential, cognitive diversity. It's about broadening reach. It's about addressing this issue of or the issue of diversity across board structures. But I think there could be some real financial, tangible commercial gains from doing it as well.
Oh, completely. And diversity of boards, diversity of decision-making structures creates diversity of thought. It goes back to this whole thing of in-group mentality. It's a natural thing that you hire people who look like you, who think like you, and therefore organizations kind of go in the way that you want them to go in the way. And a lot of work I do with international federations, if you look at them, when a new president comes in, they'll hire people around them who they want to follow their modus operandi. So actually, it's how do you if you want to make real change and be innovative, that's where you need to be diverse and have a range of people. So, and it's actually been proven. I think there was McKinsey did reports, PwC, that showing that actually it translates into financial benefits. There is a clear business case for diversity. So it's more than just a moral issue. Like Dan's pointed out, it's not just a moral issue. It's actually, it makes business sense to do this. And actually, again, it goes back to this point, how we can be having this conversation in the 21st century, that actually we're not doing something that makes complete business sense. Why?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? On the very nature of how, I guess, a rather capitalist-run society is formed, that wants to make money and wants to generate revenue. And people ask me about how the Premier League works, and I talk them through the sponsorship, commercial, broadcasting deals. That is what drives so many businesses, and it almost seems just insane that organisations wouldn't look at ways of maximising that revenue. And if board diversity is a way of achieving that, then they should be running towards that rather than being worried about what it might or might not generate.
Yeah, and if we look at sport, we're constantly competing for consumers and eyeballs, and that's the population. And why, when you're creating a strategy, you need to be thinking of how you appeal to the entire population.
Yeah.
If that decision-making power doesn't represent the entire population, you're just basically cutting out a whole sector straight away. Yeah. And that, like you said, that just doesn't make business sense.
Yeah, why focus on 50% of the market when you could focus on 100%? And it's, I remember working through some of these issues at university, 10 years ago, when we were talking about the fact there weren't enough females coming through onto some of the courses. Well, why are you marketing something to 50% of the population? We should be looking at a much broader market pool. And yeah, I'm just struggling to get my head around why it wouldn't have accelerated so quickly. But then, there's that fearful middle class white man coming into thinking again.
I think there's been a couple of comments about this, about actually, focusing on the point that unfortunately there is structural racism, and again, that is not, until we start thinking differently, then actually that's always going to be a problem, and we need to address that problem. But it's also doing it sort of gently as well, and not sort of shocking society and suddenly being forced to do something that it's not prepared to do.
Yeah. So I talked a think it was last week, all these webinars are merging into one a little bit. I talked about the way Marcus Rashford had gone about his Meals for Kids campaign, and it struck me when I was looking at the kind of evidence. So you've got this big Black Lives Matter campaign, it's very loud, it was quite noisy at times, and then you had this young black man that was being very careful and considered and mindful about his approach, and he went straight to the top of government, and he very carefully worked through those particular issues. What do you think in terms of strategy? If we start moving this, this whole debate forward, start thinking about strategy, what do you think would yield the best returns for some of this, the change that we need to see? We've talked about this, the code of governance, and that it's going through various iterations. We've talked a little bit there about commercial gain and revenue generation and so on and so forth. From your point of view, what do you think would be the big ticket items that we should be looking at in terms of strategy?
So I know that they will be considering quotas. Right. We talked about this a little bit before, and I hate quotas because I think it doesn't. While it deals with the visibility point, it doesn't deal with the mindset change. And actually, I think, and especially in this issue when we're talking about organizational racism and inherent bias, I think sometimes it can serve to be counterproductive and actually encourage those anti feelings. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a sort of a three-pronged approach that I have in my head that's focusing on changing mindsets, which is we start at the base where we assume that we don't operate fairly. And actually we have to be internally motivated to do the right thing. I recently spoke to someone post Black Lives Matter whose organization had dealt with this not in a great way. And they were presented to the board, and the response from the CEO had been to say, it was remarkable that she'd been given the opportunity to petition the board, and was this going to be an opportunity for all employees to share their sob stories? Mm-hmm. And for me, that was a real, it was outstanding that they even said that, but then also it was also a complete demonstration of a lack of motivation to change. So again, it comes back to this point of people wanting to change and having the right mindset to change, and then how you do that. You then need to look at the countermeasures and how we change bias, and that is exposure to atypical people, atypical roles, like I talked about, female pilots and male nurses, but not just having quotas. And I think actually the best way to do that is storytelling. There are a lot of people in these positions. There are a lot of people out there who are vocal, actually putting the spotlight on them and showing actually that there are people in these roles who are doing them really well. And then that's where your osmosis comes in, because then people start to think it's not so abnormal to see people in these positions. And then there's this sort of breaking of the link between bias and behaviour. And actually that's when you look at diversifying selection committees. Mm-hmm. So they don't just have white men appointing roles, because you have this sort of in-group bias where you then appoint people who look and sound like you. Whereas if the selection committee is diverse, then that sort of counters it. Mm. And then actually you then that's how you end up having a mix in these roles. And then there are also stereotypal replacement exercises. There's a lot of, there's so much research on inherent bias and how you do it. Mm-hmm. But I understand why I'm sure we will move towards quotas, but I just think that it's challenging, and I think there's a real danger that actually we're going to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, we talked about that, didn't we, with Heather when we did the pre-call on this on was it Tuesday, I think, with the danger with quotas, and it left me reflecting on what I do in my job at the university. And we do a huge amount of training around things like unconscious bias, but the biggest single change I've seen to how we recruit staff now is by having panels as you've just outlined. So we would look across our faculties or our colleges, and we'd make sure that those recruitment panels are made up of a much more diverse group of people, rather than this kind of very stereotypical white male that it still exists in large parts of higher education, or at least white male, white female, because of how my sector has moved on over the last few years, and it has certainly led to a better degree of diversity. It's nowhere near finished. I think we're just scratching the surface of it. But from a positive action point of view, it's a much more comfortable way of addressing this, rather than the quota system that you've kind of outlined there, and the potential negative fallout that we might get from that.
No, and I just from my personal experience, I don't recall the last time I was interviewed by anyone other than a white male or female.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that point. I don't know if it was because of my diverse makeup or what, but certainly I'm sure if there were people who were more diverse, then it would have affected the outcome potentially.
Yeah. So getting a couple of comments I think it was a comment I made about the Black Lives Matter and the Marcus Rashford comparison. And I think what this probably goes back to is some of the media discussion that you and I had earlier on, and the position of the media in some of that. So from my point of view, what I consumed on those two campaigns was, big marches for Black Lives Matter, very high profile in the press, whereas Marcus Rashford, by contrast, was much quieter. The interviews that we saw with him were, seated in his back garden on the BBC, and there was a very considered narrative in that regard. On the basis that your own personal consumption can be so different, what lessons do you think the media can take from, I guess, both of those campaigns, and how can they propel a much more balanced narrative, do you think, to affect change?
I mean, I
Apart from that, because I'm getting heat of my statement.
Well, I think unfortunately the media is biased. I mean, we all know that, right? They've got an agenda, and they've got, but again, probably that's to do with the makeup of the decision makers in those roles. But certainly it goes back to the point that God, I'd love to go back to a day when we had objective reporting from the media, because actually that's what it should be, because then we should be looking at all these cases together, because they're all major issues. But for me, it's difficult, and I'm sure the Marcus Rashford point was pushed a lot more because he is a high profile footballer. And actually that's what's been great about the Premier League getting behind the Black Lives Matter movement. It's given us so much visibility of this, because it is a big sport and it's on all of our televisions all the time. Whereas perhaps it's not to undermine the work that the smaller federations are doing around this, which is equally important, because again, it goes back to that point, they're targeting a different demographic, a different group of people. But certainly the visibility that you get from that is, you're getting.
Yeah, it's all right. I think we need to call it out. The questions like this need to come out. So. Yeah, so carry on, finish what you were saying, and then I'll respond as well.
No, I mean, I do believe that the media has a responsibility in all of this, and has actually probably contributed quite significantly to the problem up until now. We know that they will change their minds, that they will switch, because now at the moment it's fashionable to look at that. But they have a responsibility, and they should be involved in this process. Whatever strategy is decided moving forward, actually the media should be encouraged to get behind that and to push that. But it's really challenging. It's I don't know the answer.
I don't think I do either. It's the whole discussion is just very enlightening to me. We talked on Tuesday with Heather. That was enlightening, and I think the whole process of education, of being really quite upfront about how people feel in these contexts, the challenges that we face, the evidence that we build around ourselves to generate and form opinions is going to be absolutely vital as we move forward. And I think platforms such as this, whether we're reading blog pieces, whether we're reading stuff in the media, whether we are working through new education programs, whatever it might be, I think all will contribute to a far greater understanding of all of the issues that are rising here. If I flick up through the comments here, there's discussions about language, there's discussions about how certain words are used, the impact that those words have. that we simply don't challenge enough. And I don't profess to have all the answers to that, and I'm sure you don't either. And it's this evolutionary process that we need to, continue to go through, continue talking about, and continue educating people
and I think
for years.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think we need to keep talking about it. I think, the more people like myself, the more people like Rashford, the more people who are in these positions where they can talk about it, then actually the idea is to make it more comfortable to be talking about it. It's all right to say, I don't know. It's all right to say, I don't know how it feels. But the idea is that by us talking about our experiences, then actually perhaps people will really start to understand what it is being an ethnic minority in an industry that, or any diverse, sorry, I shouldn't just say that, it's being disabled, it's being LGBTQ and being discriminated against, and how we can all collectively change our mindsets to stop that happening in the future.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite a good place for us to stop. I normally aim for about half an hour and we've gone for 45 minutes. I appreciate we won't have answered everybody's questions. I appreciate we've probably raised even more questions that we need to solve. One thing that I am absolutely confident about is that InSport education are looking at these issues with the likes of yourself and the likes of Heather and Sarah could see. We're building new programs. We need further information about how we construct that educational offer. So, from my position as host on this particular webinar, if anybody is listening that'd like to get involved, we're building these future programs. We want to educate leaders of the future in the right way and in a really progressive way. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, then please let us know. I'm sure the guys back at the office would be really happy to hear from you. Ro, from my point of view, thanks for 45 minutes of education. It's been an incredible experience for me. I hope I haven't touched too many nerves or put my foot in it too often. What I will say is it's been a wonderful conversation to have with you. Your passion and determination for the issues that you're raising is absolutely unquestioned, and the way in which you've conveyed those ideas has been really engaging as well. So from my point of view, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody that's watched today and that will tune in on the recording would mirror that sentiment.
Thanks very much, Rob.
All right, so we'll have a very uncourteous switching off of the webinar now. It will just dump you out when I say goodbye. So thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. Ro, thanks for joining. I'll see you all soon, and I'm sure we'll catch up again soon, Ro. Take care.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.